Gary talking from a session earlier today, but I also want to introduce two other speakers that were going to be talking about the new USPS network. First, we have Mike Plunkett, who is president of Postcom, and then we have Hamilton, who is president of ACMA. So the three of us have all been active in some discussions that have been going on with the Postal Service for quite some time. And I do want to qualify that this is very future forward-looking. Don't take any of this as written in stone.
Work in progress.
Yes, work in progress. And we're also just happy to be engaged with the Postal Service and having the discussions with them about what they're thinking about their network, what it might be, and then what those implications would be on the mailing industry. And so actually these discussions have been going on for a while now, and I'm going to turn it over to Hamilton to kind of introduce and provide everyone a little bit of background.
Thanks, Bob. A great conference. You guys are doing a great job, as usual. So we've been talking to the Postal Service about flats costs for some time, unfortunately with very little impact. We at ACMA have been tracking the unit cost of flats, the reported attributable cost, using the postal-approved, regulator-approved methodology, and we've been publishing it every year and updating it. We've actually been able to go back to about over 30 years at this point, and we publish all our work papers and data and formulas, and nobody's taken us on as being completely wrong. So we're going to accept it as being pretty darn right, and the tail of the tape is pretty sad. The reported cost of flat mail has gone up at 2.5x the rate of inflation for over 30 years. Let me say that again, 2.5x the rate of inflation. In where is that acceptable to any of us? And it represents a real tragedy with flat-shaped mail. So I've spent a lot of time with PMG Potter on this, PMG Donahoe, PMG Brennan, a lot of great talk, not any action of any consequence. And in 2020, we had another discussion around flat costs, and the then chief operating officer said, "I'm responsible for flat costs." I said, "Oh, bless you. That's great to hear. And let's talk about how we can change it and bring this down. And we don't want a 5%er here. We need a material change in flat costs because we don't want to be underwater. We want to be a profitable product for you. And oh, by the way, we don't want to have PRC imposed surcharges, and we do want incentives, which we have been not qualified for. The Postal Service has talked to us over the years about some ways to get us to prospect more, to mail more catalogs, and because we're not making any money, we're not qualified to do that. So this persistent flats problem has got to be addressed. And Dave agreed, and we put together a group, a fairly small group, and we met over at the Bolger Center in Potomac, Maryland. And it was the first time that I have ever really been in a meeting with a broad group of postal folks and mailers where it was like truth serum was poured into the meeting. Everybody was really honest about everything. There was no sacred cows, there was nothing off the table. And we started to have a very high quality of conversation around ideation and priorities and execution, testing and execution on how we could materially change flats costs. And I've been very pleased with the progress and the dialogue. That process, which we'll get into in just a minute, ended up morphing to some degree into changing the network. And changing the network is, in many respects, an enabler of flat cost reduction, or I should say, of hoped flat cost reduction. And we've still got a lot of work to do, but we went out and piloted some things and looked at the data of were we moving the needle, and I guess I'll leave it with that. That's kind of the background. You'll sometimes hear it referred to as the Bolger Group, which is on the slide, and we've kind of taken a pause on the network piece. And I guess I'll just kick it back over to you guys to add stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think Hamilton's correct. You know, there's been some long-standing, persistent cost challenges that have affected flats. Tremendous respect to the Postal Service for acknowledging the need to take a look at the network and really rethink things, because you're not going to achieve the kinds of things that the PMG hinted at last night about major cost reductions without being willing to reevaluate and rethink how the network is designed. And it quickly became apparent, I think, that once you really did a deep dive on flats, you couldn't isolate flats alone. And it sort of developed into a broader perspective on the future of the network. And again, tremendous respect to the Postal Service for realizing that including customers and their suppliers in those discussions in the early stages is going to produce a better outcome in the long run than otherwise would have happened.
So we've done a bunch of things. We started off by diagramming all of the flats workflows, and it was just a nightmare of spaghetti on the chart. It was hard to read. We started trying to isolate different cost drivers in the different workflows because they don't all have the same costs. We started to talk about what might be different workflows that could remove processing steps and remove waste and remove redundancy and remove unnecessary preparing and transportation, which your supplier's quad does on your behalf. And it was as Mike said, a really good dialogue. But it became obvious that we need just one flats workflow. We don't need to have periodicals and marketing mail, and first-class flats is not a particularly large category, running in three different workflows, and an origin workflow and a destinating workflow. There's just a lot of unnecessary complexity. And there's automated equipment in that process, which we've been telling the Postal Service for years doesn't serve them well. We've been trying to get data on what the cost is of the FSS. I think last time I was with you in Washington, we talked about our expected delta on FSS versus the manual system that it replaces, which is 3.5x the manual replacement. So it just clearly wasn't working. And this leadership team finally recognized that. You'll remember back to the day when we had 5.6% surcharge on FSS zones, and we were able to get them to remove that, but we weren't able to get them to really disclose how the system is operating. And they've just finally decided it's costing more to maintain than they're saving in cost. So that was an outcome of this work.
Okay, and I want to touch on just a couple of things, because one of the things that we needed to align on is terms and understanding of what we were actually talking about. And so, for example, on this slide where we talk about the working mail subgroup, working with Postal Service operations, the definition of working mail is anything that is not able to make it onto an SCF or better pallet. So we use that as our definition of working mail. And so one of the things we were talking about is, okay, how do we get more of that mail that falls below out? And because obviously there's just a lot more cost.
Maybe we should define what an SCF pallet is. Or does everyone know that?
Does everyone? Yeah, I guess there are a number of different pre-sort levels. It starts out where you can have, we were talking earlier today, making direct carrier route pallets, and you can make 5-digit pallets. 3-digit pallets are optional but can be made, so they cover a single 3-digit or multiple 3 digits. And then when you get to the SCFs and SCF facilities, and we've actually got some maps that we'll bring up and give you a feel for it, but an SCF facility serves either a single 3-digit or multiple 3-digit zip codes. And so you can build an entire pallet, and that pallet can get moved to that plant, and then all the mail on there is serviced by that single facility, and they push it out to the individual delivery units.
So we eliminate a whole bunch of sorts. We get mail where it needs to be close to the destinating, and it gets cross-docked and goes right into delivery, as opposed to all the processing steps that occurred otherwise.
Yes. And go ahead.
And that, as you might expect, would create optimal efficiency and, I would argue, produce some significant improvements in service performance. Because if that stuff can get entered deep in the network with minimal handlings. It saves time, effort, and expense for everybody.
All right. So what we wanted to do first is make sure we had a conversation to talk about terms, because as Postal Service operations is moving forward, they are changing some of the terms that we are used to using. Starting at the most granular level, delivery units continue to be delivery units. No real change there. The SCF facilities, which everyone refers to, the drop ship DSCF rate. SCF, that term is going to be going away likely in the future, and they'll be referred to as PDCs, or processing and distribution centers. The other thing that Sharon was kind of alluding to is part of the discussion and what the Postal Service has been looking at is the current NDC network. Again, for the flat mail world, you can get the DNDC discount. She noted earlier today how they're not incentivizing or doing all the pass-through associated to that price, because ultimately what they're looking at is going forward, the NDC network will become packages only. And so that means that the flats need to flow through a different system. And that new system is two facilities, really. STCs, which are surface transfer centers. STCs are facilities that have no processing equipment, but they have the ability to cross-dock pallets. So they can move flat mail very efficiently because they're not processing it. All it does is it comes in and they know where it needs to go out to. The NDC network that we're familiar with, they're going to be replaced with regional PDCs, and we have a map that shows this. So each STC, and there's 13 of them are across the United States, handle all the cross-dock. So SCF or better pallets flow into the STC. Anything that falls below an SCF pallet needs to be worked, and it needs to be worked in a facility that has processing equipment. Those are going to be regional PDCs. These regional PDCs, there's going to be one of those near, but not the same facility, but near every one of the STCs. And then finally, people are familiar with the ASFs. Those are now going to be referred to as area PDCs. And in the maps that we go to, the Postal Service is still evaluating whether or not the area PDCs are something they really even need or not.
So the NDCs, there's something like 50 of them, and so in theory, instead of having to go to 50 different spots for a drop, you can go to 13 spots. We should save some cost there as well, hopefully.
Yes.
If they're in the right place.
Yeah. Feel free, if anyone has questions as we're going along, to ask them. So next, what we're going to do is just cover them. And so, as we were just talking about the number, so in the current environment, there is 21 NDCs and 8 ASFs. And you can see where they are located across the United States. So now in red is where the STC facilities currently exist. And one of the things I should call out too is these STC facilities, a couple of them are new, but for the most part, they've been around for a while, and they were primarily used to handle first-class mail. And if you look at where they're currently located, I would argue that it was designed based on locations where mail had to be flown into, potentially, and processed and worked there. So now, if we just look at the STCs and the regional PDCs, there's going to be 13 and 13. And so this will essentially, for anyone that was previously entering mail at an NDC, you essentially had, sorry, I should go back, you had 29 potential entry locations between the NDCs and the ASFs. In the new world, if you were going in at an NDC level, you would, anything that was an SCF or better pallet would have to go to the STC, and then any of the other mail that you would today be entering into an NDC would actually have to be taken over to the regional PDC. So it's really going from 29 different locations down to 26 potential entry locations.
Although in some specific locations, this might mean 2 entry points where previously there had been 1, because none of the 13 pairs are in the same building location.
And just to give everyone a little bit of an idea of the outreach, this is kind of each one of the STCs and then in today's terms, the SCFs that they would be servicing. And in the future, it would be the PDCs that they would be servicing. And one of the things that we did point out to the Postal Service is, again, if you look at where the STCs were located, it probably made sense to have one in, for example, if you look in the western side of the country, the STCs in Salt Lake. Well, for many of you that know, there's a whole lot of mail that is produced here in this area. It would actually, I would argue, make more sense to have an STC in Denver that we could drop into, and then have Denver be the STC and network out to those facilities out in the West. But, again, those were the types of feedback that we were giving to the Postal Service for them to think about as they're looking at potential options here. Any question? Because that's kind of the background, and next, as we get into the next slides, Mike's going to take over.
So just to summarize, we're simplifying by moving to shape-based processing, having everything right on the same trucks, and supposedly dropping them at strategically located areas where they don't need to be worked and put through machines, but they can just be fed right out to the plants, or what we call the STCs today.
Yep.
And that is a major driver of cost elimination.
Right. And one of the things to note is being able to enter in at the SCF level, or in the future it'll be referred to as a PDC, that will still exist. So if you've got the density and the Postal Service has the right signals and incentives to go to the PDCs, those will still exist. And then when you don't, it'll become the combination of STCs and the regional that you would be entering.
So this diagram is probably a challenge to read from a distance, but I don't think it's critical that you have a detailed understanding of how that product is going to flow. I think what's important here is, if you think about the way the network is designed today, they're essentially two separate networks for origin entered mail. You've got an first-class mail network designed around service standards that are now really no longer in place. The first-class mail is now a 5-day product. And so while that was not something we celebrated, it does create an opportunity for substantial savings if the Postal Service can reconfigure its network and unite these currently separate flows. And that refers not just to the alignment of service standards, but the sort of class and shape expectations as well. So I think in his remarks last night, the PMG was talking about needing to fill their trucks. And that's not just going to come through growth in packages, but through harmonization of the surface networks that serve all the different mail products, to be able to get a unified network that makes better utilization of transportation, processing, and labor capacity than is possible with the split network that we have today.
And you heard the Postmaster General talking about aggregating and deaggregating, aggregating, deaggregating as mail is moving through the system. All those handling steps we're paying for. Ideally, we're going to eliminate a lot of that in some of this shift.
And last night I think is about the 5th time I've heard PMG DeJoy speak. That's the first time I ever heard him really go after nodes as something he doesn't like. And I think this is what he's talking about. You can shrink the number of nodes and end up with a much more efficient, cost-effective network than they have today. And that's where I think he sees, and I think we agree, we see significant cost reduction and savings opportunities.
I think I've heard that he went to Atlanta and drove around the city and followed mail, and there was 200 nodes in Atlanta. He didn't say the city, but my guess it was in Atlanta.
It was Atlanta, yeah.
And that it was just super wasteful. And we got very close to signing off on this and pulling the trigger and implementing, and then they have just recently taken a bit of a pause. I think they're going to try to be more aggressive in some of the moves that they're going to be making as a result of the PMG's trip to Atlanta, and they may even simplify this and streamline it more than it is. So that's the question mark. That's late breaking news. We're not quite sure how that's going to work out, but we think it's great.
There might be another factor. I mean, and I'm going to tie this back to kind of what Sharon was talking about this morning. To really maximize the opportunity here, you really do need to rethink not just the network, but all of the products that are going into the network. And when Sharon kind of lamented the constraints placed upon her by the regulator, she's not kidding. And the current state of regulation does not lend itself to an easy redesign of products. You've got to do things incrementally over time. And with the current regulatory restrictions that are in place, that's not easy. And so thinking through how to execute this over a multi-year strategy under current regulations is just inherently challenging.
You've never done her job. You wouldn't know what you're talking about.
I
Mike
never had to do it under such
sheriff.
trying circumstances.
Mike's past life was in a similar role, right?
But I've forgotten everything I ever knew.
And you're atoning for your sins.
Again, don't expect anyone to really digest all of this in detail from a distance, but the illustration here is how you've got sort of very complex and not synchronous operating plans for how the Postal Service processes the different shapes and products that travel through its network today, and is what creates the baseline from which these opportunities can be extracted.
Right, and one of the things I do want to point out is if you look at the very bottom row there, it shows essentially the process that the Postal Service goes through on a nightly or daily basis where, okay, they have an order and a sequence of all the different products that they're running. So they have destinating packages. They load them up on the machine, run them through, stop the machine, clear it, get it set up, run marketing bundles, stop the machine, clear it, run periodical bundles, stop the machine, clear it, run destinating packages, and rinse and repeat until you get all the way to the end. And so there was a lot of downtime, clearing the machine, getting it set up to rerun the next product that was coming. So as we were talking about, the harmonization of the different products actually leads into a simplified flow on the bottom.
Right, and as you can toggle back and forth in your minds from that previous slide, as Bob indicated, if you look at the bottom bar, gone from about 8 or 9 separate breakdowns and setups to 3 because of the simplification of the network. And every one of those switches from one category to the other creates opportunity, well, not opportunities for, but by definition, setup costs that no longer have to exist. It also creates possible bottlenecks for service issues that can be eliminated through this simplification. So again, it's an end state. It's going to take some time to get there, but greatly simplified with opportunities for major cost reductions, and I would hope and expect service improvements.
Isaac Cronkite is the lead at the Postal Service on this, and he's been a student of history and noticed that sometimes the Postal Service moves too quickly and disconnects from the supply chain. Oftentimes it moves too slowly and frustrates the supply chain, and their goal is to try to do this just right, to get the porridge just the right tempo, or I'm mixing my metaphors, but to try to make sure that we move efficiently, but we telegraph it well in advance, and that all the supply chain partners are on board and know what to expect. So I think if they're able to do that, that is great, and they've already started to take out some FSS machines as an example. not do it too quickly and overwhelm their delivery units, not do it too slowly, and not get the financial benefit of it.
And our goal is and has been to provide them with helpful feedback so that as they're evaluating different options, they can be more informed about what the possible impacts will be. And I've been very impressed by how much they have listened and how much they have made what have appeared to have been sort of real-time
Modifications.
changes in decision-making based on input from industry experts.
All right, and since we're talking about FSS, just to go in a little bit more detail about that, Postal Service purchased 100 of these machines. Essentially, right as that happened is when flats volume fell off a cliff. The machines have really never been proved financially viable, and so one of the things that the Postal Service has started doing is now I think it was going back to 2020, they tarped 21 of the 100 machines. And so when we say it tarped it, basically the machine was still there, but they weren't running it anymore because what they were able to do in a number of their facilities, they had more than one of them, and they were able to still run all the same sort schemes on a smaller equipment footprint because there was less volume going through. And so they've been starting now actually pulling some of those 21 TARP machines out. And so those that may not know, one FSS machine is essentially the size of a football field. It was 50 semi-loads of equipment to build one. So that's how big they are. And so they're able to now start repurposing that space for other things like packages. Yeah, packages.
Monstrosity comes to mind
Yes.
when I think about the FSS.
So there is going to be an evolution there, and the Postal Service has said that it's going to happen slowly over time, but eventually FSS will go away. It's probably going to be a multi-year process, and what we'll see is the label list that controls making mail up for an FSS machine, that label list will gradually shrink over time to the point where it eventually just disappears when they finally unplug the last machine. Any questions?
They've already been amortized, and so effectively there's no write-off required.
Although what will immediately start to happen is equipment in a facility requires ongoing maintenance. And with equipment of that size, the maintenance expenses are non-trivial. So the more the Postal Service can mothball and take out those pieces of equipment, the direct operating costs will come down.
And our attributable cost is also getting hit not only with maintenance, but with space charges.
That's correct.
So there's a lot of cost that will start to come out that is goodness for us.
And it takes a lot of people to operate that machinery. And cost per piece on an FSS is probably much higher than on any other piece of automation equipment in a postal facility processing any shape of mail in any category. So the removal of that equipment has the potential to create significant, direct, measurable cost savings at the specific product level.
Okay.
You believe that the flats are subsidizing other classifications of mail with the overheads?
I'd say
You
no.
go first.
No, I don't feel after 15 years of hard study that I really still understand it. There's piggyback factors, and it's just enormously complicated the way it's set up. I think this Postmaster General recognizes that there's a cost to complexity. I hope he does. I think he does. And we've certainly known in operating businesses, as we lean out a process and reduce the complexity and non-standardization of the diversity of standards or non-standardization, we can lower some costs. He asked, what is a non-machinable flat? And the response was, well, it depends on what plant you're in. And that's because there are no standards across the plants of how they, equipment sets and how they operate, their operating plans. There's a lot of diversity, and that's an artifact of the way the Postal Service used to operate prior to Joy's arrival, and still does to a certain extent, where There's the bozos in headquarters that tell you how you're supposed to do it, and then there's those of us here in the plant and in the area. We know best, we know how to do it, and we're gonna adapt to local conditions and do it the way we think is best. So that's kind of where they've come from. But I can't tell you that I fully understand the cost attribution that they do, and that it has any basis in reality. I don't know that that is the case either. I do know that some of the things we're doing are the right things operationally to remove cost and should have goodness associated with them. Do I think we are subsidizing or being subsidized? Because there's two edges to that sword. You know, the postal accounting says we are being subsidized because we're not covering our attributable cost. I don't know that I believe that. There's so many anomalies in the reported figures that they don't have credibility to me. And we've pointed out a lot of those each year in the annual compliance determination process. If you're suffering from insomnia, I'm happy to flip those submissions to you. And so I don't really have confidence. I hope at some point I can't say what I just said. What's your take on it?
So I think it's important to remember what postal costing systems were designed to do. They were designed to allocate costs to different products for regulatory purposes to ensure that there was no cross-subsidization between different classes of mail. So the Postal Service has exhaustive detail on how those unit cost estimates are developed by product, by shape, by class, and they have the weight of decades of precedent behind them. That's a good thing in a way because it makes the costs stable and reliable over time, but it has some real negatives. The systems were not designed in any way to support decision-making at an operational level or to make informed judgments about how best to set prices. And I'll give you an example. One of the issues facing flats over the last 10 years at least has been that the Postal Service argues, and I think credibly, that as volumes decline, some of the fixed costs of operating their plants get spread over a smaller number of pieces, which by definition will increase costs. Well, the PRC, for historical reasons, assumes that mail processing costs are 100% volume variable, which is complete at odds with, I think, most people's intuitive sense of how costs behave and with observed reality. So I would argue that even for flat products that are considered to be non-compensatory, the rates are still above the marginal cost of flats entering the network, but the systems were not designed to produce information that would allow you to reach that conclusion and maybe make better pricing decisions. So, you know, the issue of flats incentives or flats promotions, I think, is something that should be seriously considered, because if you have excess capacity, one way to deal with that is pull more volume into the network. And arguably, I'm going to boil this down and try to nutshell this. The current system assumes that the average cost is equal to the marginal cost of processing a flat, and it isn't. And unfortunately, the existing systems were not designed to tease out that difference, and so the Postal Service is sort of handicapped in the information available to them to make decisions. The subsidy question, that's a tougher one.
Just maybe I'll jump in.
Yeah.
So Mike said what he said. What I heard is we've got over a 2-decade-old costing system that was designed by lawyers for compliance purposes. Geez, and doesn't give the operators any real information about how the operation is running. I'm sure you'd love that in your business.
A lot. Regulation does drive a lot of decisions. And yes, these systems were really not designed for making good decisions. That's not what they're meant to do. They're meant to provide data for the regulator to determine legal compliance. I don't think that's optimal. I think better systems could be in place, but you know, there's a lot of inertia, both with the Postal Service and the regulator. And having been
Don't
inside
get me
L'Enfant
started on the
Plaza,
regulator.
yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of obstacles to change. And when you're in a highly regulated environment, those multiply. I'll leave it at that.
Great question.
Yeah, any other questions?
You know, something I probably should also say is I haven't been able to put pencil and paper to this and satisfy myself that we're headed towards a material cost reduction because it hasn't been finished yet. But Sharon Owen has been a great partner in this, participated in a lot of the meetings, as have all the postal folks with industry. And I do a sanity check with her periodically. Are we getting to the promised land? Are we getting there? And she keeps nodding, yes, she's satisfied that we're making the kind of progress we need to be making. So that gives me confidence.
I agree 100%, but I'm going to temper that confidence because I think one of the challenges in trying to understand the savings opportunity is the actual execution. Even if the network is perfectly designed and the products are redesigned to be optimal for the network, which will be a significant undertaking in and of itself, then you have the task of taking the costs out. And the costs are 80% labor. And
It's not a great track record there.
well, in fairness to the Postal Service, when they try hard to take significant costs out in labor, what happens? Congress intervenes, right? You can't close that plant in my district. You say you're going to get rid of a shift in Sioux Falls? No. So the Postal Service will face, and we need to be in a position to try to help the Postal Service when it comes time to actually take the costs out. Understanding them is hard enough, but actually removing them is going to be a bigger challenge by far.
Right, and there's no goodness unless these costs get removed.
That's right, because otherwise,
They'll just be allocated someplace else.
back in the 90s, you had what were called automation refugees. As the Postal Service automated letter operations, labor costs didn't go down as much as the productivity numbers would have indicated that they should have. And so I forget who coined the term, but they labeled these employees automation refugees because they suddenly didn't have any work to do, but it was very hard to get them off the rolls and out of the system. And so it's not hard to envision something similar happening with a really solid network redesign plan when it comes time to execute.
In fairness, we have talked about this and making sure that we get the cost reductions, so this is not something that hasn't been spoken.
So just to come back a little bit to one of the goals moving forward is really to focus on shape-based processing, kind of using the new revised first-class standard as, I would say, the baseline. And then one of the things that the Postal Service was proposing here is the service standards. You know, again, this is now, if we just looked at origin entered, so potentially, going through the entire stream. Periodicals, the current standard is 3 to 9 days. End to end, they believe that could get down to 3 to 8 days, so they could take a day off the tail. Marketing mail is currently 3 to 10 days. They believe they could get it down to 3 to 8, kind of using the fact that as the PMG described last night, that they're looking to take more mail out of the air, put it on the ground, and then they can merge this other mail with it.
And your average time to deliver on both of those will come down as well.
Yep. So,
which the PMG did mention last night.
and just, if you're wondering what CONUS is, it's just referencing, operations uses a lot of acronyms, but it's just continental United States. So, yeah, not talking about Alaska, Hawaii.
No.
Okay, so this one of the things that the Postal Service did as they looked at the service, if they did propose the service change, was what is the impact to service pairs? So service pairs are essentially 3-digit to 3-digit, as you looked across.
From origin to destination.
Yes, yes.
City pairs.
Yes. So for periodicals, and as you can tell, this slide is a little bit older. This is not reflective of the.
It is not reflective of the recently proposed change in service performance measurement plan.
For periodicals are well aware, the Postal Service is actually proposing to change the CET to 8 o'clock.
8 o'clock, right.
And so clearly these discussions were happening before that. But anyway, using the 11 o'clock CET, 61.6 of the pairs would have service downgrades for periodicals. And then looking over at marketing mail with CET is 1,600, 87.3 of the pairs would have service upgrades.
And with the reduction of the critical entry time to 8 o'clock, the first number is going to go up or down?
That's a good question. I would argue it would probably look better with an 8 o'clock CET. Yeah. But that would probably mean, though, that the lived experience of periodicals mailers in terms of actual service performance might actually seem worse.
Right, because if you get there, say 8:30, you're already your day zero is off by 1 hour.
And they are aware of this issue. It's particularly an issue for weeklies. It's not really an issue for monthlies. And so my sense is they're going to try to have a solution to it.
And this goes into a little bit more detail on the shape-based processing. So the main thing they're calling out here is 38.4% would be service upgrades for periodicals. Oh, so they were talking about, already starting to think about the 8 o'clock CET, okay? So there's what, we just answered the question. That's what the improvement would be with going to 8 o'clock. Right. Any questions on any of that?
And I think it's fair to say that I don't think you have a marketing mail here, but the same.
I don't think so.
Yeah, the same thing is going to be noticed on the marketing mail side as well. We'll get rid of some of the long tail, and over time, the average time to deliver should contract.
Right, and so what this graphic is intended to show is kind of how the end-to-end flow through the new network and the various points where mail could be entered into the Postal Service by the mailing industry at different points along the line. I don't know if either one of you have any other comments on that.
Well, the goal is to get it right to the destinating plant, which I guess we're going to call PDC now, with no handling required at all, so that the container on a pallet can get cross-docked and move on. And so a lot of the discussions that we're starting to have right now is, well, what can we do to enable that? And a lot of it is pricing signals, and there haven't been any disclosures yet about what that's going to look like. So that's still a major hurdle for us to get over, to make sure that it is, in concept, it all sounds pretty good, but is it going to be economic for us to feed it and support it the way they'd like us to?
I think Sharon hinted at it a little bit this morning in talking about how for several years the Postal Service had to eat into some of the dropship incentives because of a reference error in an Excel spreadsheet that was discovered several years back, and because of the
That's a sophisticated costing system you're talking about.
Yeah. Different issue maybe, but anyway, at least today she acknowledged they finally caught up, so they can actually start improving some of the dropship incentives to get stuff further entered into the network. And I, for one, am very pleased to hear them openly acknowledging the desire to get product entered as deeply into the network as possible for lots of reasons. So I think if you could somehow volume weight these squares, the closer you get to the actual post office, the larger the squares, the way the network is intended to work over time.
Right, and you're seeing that through the additional incentives that the Postal Service is throwing out, like we were talking about the 2 new rates that are coming in July. The Postal Service has realized the most efficient way to get mail moved is if we can get it to the destination SCF, all they have to do is take it and cross-dock it to the delivery unit, and then the delivery unit breaks it down and
Takes it to the street.
Yep.
And if I remember correctly from the filing, lots of upward room to improve those incentives because the pass-throughs are at 100% yet. So possibility of better incentives for that down the road.
And then likewise, de-emphasizing things like the NDC discount, which aren't going to be a part of the new network
Right.
for our mail.
So, any additional questions around any of that? So, like I said, I do want to qualify, a lot of yet to be determined things that are going to happen. So, the other thing we're going to have to keep in mind is these types of changes aren't going to happen in a single big bang. And so I think one of the challenges that the PMG is struggling or working through is just, okay, how do you roll this out maybe in a phased or staged basis? And they also know that there's going to be this period then where certain parts of the United States might be flowing through the new network while other parts are still flowing through the old network, and then they're going to have still have the drop ship discounts and have some sort of balance of what that discount is and align it between the two facilities. A PNDC is equal to an SCF discount, and if you go and work through all of those types of things, it's going to be a multi-year process. And I don't see exactly how that's going to work, but it's going to require collaboration between the Postal Service and the mailing industry.
Yeah, good communication. The other piece of this is because the pricing is effectively a year in arrears. Once you start getting some of these benefits, how do we bring those forward to get them more early reflected into the attributable cost, and hopefully get the regulator to back off of this horrendous 2% surcharge that we're getting, which, oh, by the way, isn't even covering the cost growth of the product. So it's driving mail out of the system, but it's not solving the problem. But that's another discussion.
Yeah, we're talking about hundreds of facilities, tens of thousands of affected employees, very complex product and pricing structure that is subject to difficult regulations. To me, this has 2025 or later written all over it.
I'm going to prognosticate a little sooner than that, and I'm also assuming that we're going to remain like dogs nipping at their heels to...
Fiscal 2023 is just around the corner. We're,
Oh, we'll see. We'll see how fast they can do it.
Really would love to be wrong, as I often am.
They do move slowly, and you got to also keep it into perspective. 2 billion seconds ago, FDR was in the White House, and we were trying to get out of World War II. 2 billion pieces of mail ago was the day before yesterday. And so when you think about the size and mission, and then you can start to understand some of the things that the PMG was saying yesterday about if I can just go out and do a greenfield build on this, and that's a lot easier than having to change an existing, fix the plane while we're flying it. Basically the analogy. So I think that will complicate things also.
He's right. I mean, it would be, if you could start from scratch, you wouldn't do it this way. And so untangling what has been built up over decades is a significant challenge.
And for those of us that have been around for a while, remember network rationalization. Yep. I have to believe it's going to have some of the same feel of that.
Goodness, no, I hope not.
Well,
I think they learned, in business we know that you just don't lay off people, you have to get rid of the work. And if you just lay off people in closed facilities and don't do any of the work, you create chaos. And that's what happened in network rationalization. I think they've learned that lesson. They will not repeat that.
Right, but there's certain steps of network rationalization that they can't avoid, such as all the work that they have to do with the unions as far as employee reassignments and movements and timing and all that kind of stuff.
Interference from Congress.
Yeah, and
that's a big
wailing and gnashing of teeth there. There'll be a lot of it. Any Other questions anyone would like to ask? Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.